Hello, everyone. It's high noon, and we'll give everyone another minute or so to gather before we begin. We'll give everyone just about another 30 seconds, and then we'll begin. All right, it's 12:01. Hello, everyone, and welcome to PGTME's fourth annual lunchtime series. My name is Tim Cripe. I'm an MD, PhD, physician scientist, pediatric hematologist, oncologist, and chief of our division at Nationwide Children's Hospital, affiliated with The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. And I'm an inaugural member of the PGTME committee, which has been an absolute joy and pleasure over the last several years. Our panelists will be introducing themselves shortly, but we are grateful to have you all here for our fourth year of hosting this event. We're always been impressed and inspired by the diverse group of attendees and thoughtful engagement. As you probably know, if you've tuned in before, PGTME is a project of the Division of Medical Ethics housed in the New York University Grossman School of Medicine's Department of Population Health. You can learn more about PGTME on the web page that Kara just dropped into the chat, and you can sign up for the quarterly newsletter to keep up with the work of the committee. So today we're going to be talking about trials on hold, balancing expectation and understanding of clinical investigations. So this is an issue that has raised a lot of angst, particularly among patients and parents, and we'll have perspectives today from diverse stakeholders. If you are unable to attend any of the talks or stay the whole time, there will be a posted live recording once this whole week is concluded, and that link will be shared with all attendees. So today we're going to have brief introductions by our panelists, followed by a discussion that I will moderate. We'll also be taking questions from the audience, and we've allowed at least 15 minutes for that at the end. So please submit your questions through the Q&A feature anytime during the discussion. So without further ado, let's turn to our panelists to hear about their expertise, qualifications, and experiences. So maybe just a brief introduction. Valerie, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thanks, Tim. My name is Valerie Tharp Byers. I'm an education and psychology researcher based out of Houston, Texas. I am also a mother to a 13-year-old boy with Sanfilippo syndrome. I am also on the board of directors for the Cure Sanfilippo Foundation and write a rare disease column for Bio News Network. My son, Will, was in an enzyme replacement therapy trial from 2015 to 2017, and that trial ended abruptly. And so that's what brings me here today to talk more about the parent and family perspective on the issue.
Fantastic. It's great to have you here, Valerie. Thank you. And Sam, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey, good to be with you. I have a few different hats that I wear, none right now, apparently, but I'm probably a physician scientist who runs clinical trials. And as is often the case, when you're in that position, you also serve on data and safety monitoring boards, or DSMBs. And I think my experience chairing or being a member of a DSMB was felt to be relevant here. I will add the extra color that for 10 years, I was a cancer husband and caregiver. And for the last 5 years of my beloved Kate's life, I helped her navigate the clinical trial landscape and did probably about 10 clinical trials that got us good quality extra life, and definitely have seen the world of the trial apparatus from a lot of different perspectives. Thanks.
It sure seems like between the two of you, we've got about 10 different life experiences from lots of different perspectives. And sorry to hear about your wife, Sam, and Valerie, about your experiences, but we're looking forward to sort of educating ourselves and everyone listening more about this topic. Sam, why don't we start with you about defining exactly what we're talking about today? What exactly is a clinical trial hold?
Yeah, and Tim, interrupt me if I get logorrheal. That's the cute word for going on at length without getting anywhere. I think we need to step back just a tiny bit. Step back maybe 70 years now, 80 years, maybe even a little more. And remember that it used to be the case that when you had a medicine, you mostly just marketed it and God bless America, here it goes, good luck. And there wasn't a lot of safety oversight, and there wasn't a lot of understanding about whether they worked. And over the course of time, but particularly in the setting of the thalidomide fiasco, where outside the US, a drug for morning sickness got marketed very quickly, despite there being a lack of good evidence for its safety. And it led to these terrible, terrible congenital birth defects. And at that moment, the FDA switched from maybe not really quite sure what role it was going to play in the marketing of medicines to a laser focus on safety. So basically what happens is you get a treatment that you hope will work for a disease. You run it through animals to make sure that it's safe to bring it to trials. And when you run it through animals, you slowly accumulate some knowledge and experience. Animals are not a perfect match for humans. And as a consequence, you don't know for sure after you've looked at animals whether something's good to go or not. But if something routinely kills animals and makes no difference for them, not really a reason to bring it to humans. So you do that initial step. You then think, I think we're ready. We've got a signal it maybe works in animals. It seems like it's safe in animals. Let's take it to first in humans. And when you make that step into humans, the FDA is very carefully aware of what you're up to, and they're going to review all the evidence. They're going to review toxicology in animals. They're going to review the animal studies for whether it works. They're going to review mechanistic chemistry, all this kind of stuff. And then they're going to watch very closely the progress of the trial. Now, in addition, there is an entity that gets assigned for a trial that's called a Data and Safety Monitoring Board. And the DSMB is experts, and it might be people like me who are scientists, trialists. It might be ethicists. It might be attorneys. Occasionally you'll have lay members. And the role of that Data Safety Monitoring Board is to be that little angel on the right shoulder of the trialists. And it's not that trialists are nefarious. I know so many of them, and I can't remember even meeting a single nefarious one, but we're human. And we have lapses in judgment, and we have stuff we don't see as clearly, because running a trial is this full-time endeavor. You give everything to it. So the Data Safety Monitoring Board is independent of the trialists, and they have the authority to tell the trialists what they need to do. And they have the obligation to keep the trialists from learning more than they ought to know about the data. And that's because of a bias that arises, and it used to arise a lot in trials, where docs would start to see some promising work, some early promising signals, and then they'd, even without realizing it, they'd sort of play the statistics in their favor, and that would lead to false judgments about whether something works and is safe. So the Data Safety Monitoring Board gets to see everything, and they share very little back with the investigators so that it can be a clean, clear, scientifically solid trial. Now, when you're on a Data Safety Monitoring Board, you're watching very carefully, and you spend a lot of hours thinking it through, because early in the phase of a trial, often what you've got to go on is intuition and risk tolerance. How much risk are you willing to tolerate that there might be a problem with safety as you're working it through? Data Safety Monitoring Board tries to make sure that to a normal person, what's being represented in the trial, what's being undertaken in the trial would seem like an appropriate risk. Now, the Data Safety Monitoring Board can make assessments. They can say, keep doing the trial, no changes. They can say, keep doing the trial, but will you look at this particular patient population and tell us what you're seeing in greater detail? So not pause anything, but give us a little more information. Or the Data Safety Monitoring Board can say, we're aware of signals in this trial. We're aware of some of the other potential context, some other information that might be had. And we're just worried enough that we don't think the trial should continue in its current state. Something needs to change. We need some new information, maybe from new animal studies, or we need to retool and reconfigure the trial before it can proceed. And that functionally is a hold. Now, the FDA, which oversees all this stuff and is the ultimate regulatory authority, they can also institute a hold. And occasionally the DSMB and the FDA may have a difference of opinion about it. And ultimately, it's a veto power. If either of those bodies says, you got to hold the trial, you got to hold the trial. Now, the other thing you can do, if you have credible evidence of a serious safety issue, you can just stop the trial. You can just say, no amount of new information is going to make this make sense. So a hold is an intermediate space. And what's really hard on the patient side of it and family side of it when there are delays is that you want to know if a promising experimental therapy is being delayed. Is it being delayed for reasons of silly bureaucracy? Or is it being delayed because it might actually harm my beloved and is not appropriate to do? And the nuance is that in order to maintain the integrity of the trial scientifically, the Data and Safety Monitoring Board frequently has to be somewhat circumspect in what they say publicly, because they want to make sure that the trial is able to run without bias. So, Tim, I hope that's useful and not too long.
Yeah, no, that's a great beginning, and I want to get into the bit about, what information is shared and why it may or may not be shared. But since you brought up sort of the impact on the patient, why don't we have Valerie tell us a little bit about her experience with her son Will on, dealing with a trial that went on hold. What was that? What happened, and what was that like?
Well, specifically in our case, we didn't end up having an immediate step. It ended up being ending. And it was not it was more of a concern that it was not reaching the endpoints, as opposed to the fact that anything was medically happening. But with my work with the foundation, we work constantly with other families who are going through the hold process. And just from the patient and parent perspective, a lot of times we go in and we're explained all this wonderful, and as wonderfully as Sam just stated it, all of the parameters. And we know that in our rational brains. But then when a hold happens, or when something is delayed or stopped, for those of us, especially in the rare disease community, where this may be the only option for our loved one's survival, it's almost like a diagnosis day all over again. It is very psychologically difficult for families who are trying their best to cope day to day with a difficult diagnosis, and this may have been their one shred of hope. And to stop that is very psychologically damaging on families, and it's hard for them to come to terms with, even with the most robust explanations and understanding, if there hasn't already been supports laid in place with the trial to help families through these situations if they would occur. So many of them are caught off guard because it does happen, and it needs to happen to keep children and other family members and loved ones safe, to have these holds in. But if we haven't supported families through this process that this could happen and prepared them with other resources, reading it on the informed consent form and living it are two different things. And so bridging that gap between families' understanding of this and handling it, and the investigator and the trial protocols, I think is a big a goal that we need to all be working towards.
So in your experience, either personal or with the foundation, what have you experienced that families get told participants get told either by the investigator, and part and parcel of that question is, have you or anyone you know ever been in contact with the sponsor themselves, the company themselves, or is it always through the investigator? What kind of messaging have you seen go out when there's a hold?
When there's a hold, it's normally very, as if in my sons, we didn't get contacted immediately by our initial contacts, who were our trusted people within the study. And I know many trials, they try to keep participants separate and not in contact. In the rare disease community, that is very hard, because in the rare disease community, we all know each other. We're all sending Christmas cards, we're all calling each other, because they're the only other families that understand our experience. So in the case of my sons, I got a text message from London before I even knew what had happened, because another family had and they're like, have you gotten this information? Because they got it in an email. And so they had no way to work through that, because it was a very cold clinical, sorry, this is what's happening. Please don't come to your appointment next week. This is what's going on. And there was no real recourse for them to talk it through with anyone immediately. So the other people they're going to talk to are the other people that are living this exact situation. And then it happened similarly with us. When I did get the official notification, it wasn't through like the nurse who we saw every week when we went for the infusions. It was through a person who I'd never met that just said, oh, sorry, we're not going to be able to pursue this anymore. We'll be in touch with other information. And there was no real follow-up for our family and patient care in terms of what should we do? How should we process this? What was the reasoning behind it? It was very much like, we're going to have to go on hold. You'll probably read a press release about it. And that's where we're at right now. And that's very difficult. It was very difficult for my family, and it's been very difficult for the other families I've known that situation has played out in that way.
It sounds like you've experienced the model of how not to do this. So Sam, from the other side, when you're on a DSMB or when you're a clinical trialist, have you thought about what messaging needs to go out and who decides what messaging and who's overseeing that? Does it have to get approved by the FDA and so forth? What are the sort of thinking around the messaging, or has there not been any?
Yeah, I like Valerie raising this. And full disclosure, the trials I do are in ARDS and sepsis rather than in chronic rare disease states, and the relationships are a little bit different there, but they're not so terribly different from the relationships that oncology clinical trials have. And in my administrative role now, I oversee a lot of our trial activity in oncology. The general assumption, but let's be honest, there've historically been big blind spots around communicating back to trial participants. And some of that comes out of anxiety about overly conservative interpretations of regulations. So strictly speaking, formal contact with trial participants is supposed to go through the IRB, and that IRB process may take 6 weeks. So you're in this weird position as a trialist investigator where, you got to talk to your patients, but you're not allowed to do anything formal without IRB approval because it's patient-facing materials, and that takes 6 weeks. I'm like, for a patient, 6 weeks for some bureaucratic process, give me a break. So then you're asking each investigator to kind of come up with their best understanding of how to interpret it. But the reality is, when it's an early treatment, that may be a major component of a company's pipeline. So the DSMB doesn't really get involved in that component of it. But there are, the Securities and Exchange Commission has opinions about how these companies communicate information that's material to investors, and got to follow those regulations. And there is there's a mix of just everybody's working so hard with so many moving parts and regulations that were designed to prevent certain kinds of inappropriate behavior having unintended consequences that really get in the way of communicating well with participants. I will say that over the last 5 years, I've seen a lot more work at the trial and trial governance level, not as much at the DSMB level, although your point is well taken, Valerie, but in terms of governance, a lot more work to think through how do we engage and communicate with participants better? What classes of information should we share with them, et cetera, et cetera. But it is worth remembering that there's a lot of regulatory inertia around the idea that when investigators communicate with patients, they're doing it to persuade them to do something that the patient may not want to do. So that's why these IRBs and all this stuff gets in the way, because the argument, which I don't think is true, but there are some outliers, I know, but overall, I don't think it's true of most trialists. But there is this worry that if you just let trialists say what they want to and the way they want to participants, that they're going to mislead them somehow and get them into a, something they shouldn't. And we're walking this line of this huge regulatory regime and all the interconnections in that next layer of the companies that are raising the money to develop and test these treatments and the hospital systems where this all happens. There's so many moving parts, and you wonder what is historically the way we've done it is just rely on the investigator to be the one who chats with the patients informally. But as a patient, if your investigator chats with you informally and says, I'm sorry, I don't know that much, I just know we're on hold, does that really reassure them? At least it's the human touch, but there are a lot of levels of complexity. But I do feel like people are doing a little bit better job of thinking generally about participant communication. But right now, in general, you get a letter, it has to be IRB approved, and you release the letter. But that can take weeks to get processed. It's not very useful to patients and families.
So there's a couple of questions in the Q&A that are relevant to this. One is relevant to that specific point. Why not sort of petition the IRB for an exception where there's an urgent need to communicate this, faster than a protocol amendment? Are there pathways essentially for recognizing that, this needs to go out more urgently than the usual kinds of things that you're talking about, and aren't there ways to sort of get that done quickly, especially if there's something that's urgent?
In my administrative job now, the head of our IRB reports to me, and I can tell you these are good people working hard, like working really hard on a lot of things. And the problem is when everything's high priority, nothing is high priority. There's only so much work they can do. And most IRBs are working as hard as they can to make sure that good trials open in a timely fashion and that any concerning safety signals are appropriately communicated in a way that prevents people from entering a trial they would not enter if they had full information. So the nuance is that it's emotionally searing, and medically, in general, when a trial is on hold or shut down, it's because the treatment wasn't working. So the IRBs are having to prioritize situations where people may be actively getting dosed and need to make sure that they're not getting dosed if there's a safety signal, for example, or making sure that new safety problems are correctly identified. So my only worry about that is if you ask the IRBs that are already working at their full capacity, every time there's a trial hold, drop everything and focus on that. That means that they're not going to be able to drop everything and focus on getting the next trial open in a timely fashion or keeping track of the actual safety signals. So, I mean, it's at some level, it's the cost of safety. Being safer is slower, and you have to pick your battles. And sometimes you can get these regulatory systems to be more flexible, but generally they've focused on the things that are life or death impairment kinds of issues for like moving really quickly. And the other stuff moves a little slower, and communication, as urgent as it is, I think for us, for me as a caregiver for those 5 years on trials, I was irritated and frustrated when they were slow with me, but I needed them to move immediately if they had new evidence that my Kate's treatment was unsafe. And that's where they prioritize, honestly.
Sure, and it's really great to get your perspective, both from the administrator as well, one of your other many hats. There are a couple comments. One was that couldn't holds be anticipated and the communication sort of be pre-ready, but I'll comment that the reason there are holds is there's something unanticipated, right? That there's a safety signal. And also comment that the FDA does have to get notified within a certain 24, 48-hour period for certain levels of safety signals, and then things go out to all the sites pretty urgently. So there are times when it's, arguably a safety issue that things get done pretty quickly, that go to the IRB later, that go out to all the clinical trial sites immediately. So I guess the other thing that's relevant to what we're kind of talking about, just to backtrack a little bit, is question about how well do you think that DSMBs understand the patient preference for benefit and risk? Because if the DSMB sort of, weighing that and deciding whether to hold or not, is there any input from, I think sponsors do get input from stakeholders, patients, advocacy groups while they're creating trials, but what about as the trial's ongoing and when there's a judgment to be made? I don't know, Valerie, have you ever gotten involved or seen anyone through your foundation get involved with sort of advocating at those levels beyond just the trial creation?
We do. As you mentioned, we work really hard with the trial creation, trying to get patient and family-centered endpoints put in place, but we also want to keep that communication open during the trials. Again, speaking from a rare disease perspective, our risk assessments were pretty high, especially in Sanfilippo, which is a terminal condition. We know what is going to happen to our children. We know where we're faced. We're willing to take risks that maybe other families in different situations are not open to. But that's why you have to have that type of communication so you can understand that population and their perspective more thoroughly. So we do work with that and do work to connect the patient advocacy with the trial and trial company and sponsoring organizations ongoing anytime that we do have, again, in the rare disease, anytime we do have the opportunity to have a trial start and go forward, because we want it to complete and we also want that data. It gets very concerning to us with holds and trial stops. What happens to that data that the families have graciously given of their time and their loved ones' time and assess that risk? We don't want that data to be lost. It's still valuable, even if a trial goes on hold or if a trial ends. How is that data going to be used going forward? That's another consideration that I would like to see more addressed in clinical trials, because that's valuable to us. And many families feel ownership. They wanted to do the trial not only for their own family member, but to better the community as a whole. And that's another thing to take into consideration.
And someone commented that if the trial is concluded for endpoint issues, the people in the trial should know before the general public. You're sort of talking about that in terms of access to data. That may not always be known, though, because you don't know, even if you're a trial participant, you don't know what the other participants, other than through your family groups, are experiencing.
And also in terms of the endpoint data, again, from the rare disease perspective, we want them to be patient-centered endpoints. So if the endpoint data before we signed on the trial was this needs to be a cure, and the families are like, well, we see quality of life benefit, and the trial's like, but it didn't meet the endpoint that we had already set up, that's where a lot of disconnect with patient advocacy and the trial list happen. Because if we're seeing benefit, whether it be physical, mental, a slowing down of progression benefit, but it's not meeting the prerequisite of curing or stopping progression of a regressive disease, maybe we're okay with that. Maybe we're okay with the quality of life improvement, even if it's not what the endpoint was hoped to be. But because that was the endpoint, the trial is then, well, it's not successful, we have to stop it, we won't pursue this any further. And that's where a lot of families get very frustrated and depressed, and it hurts the community, because then the community may not want to move forward and enroll their child or loved one in a trial because they've seen that these holds and endpoints have negatively affected other families.
Is there typically a patient advocate on a DSMB? I've been on some DSMBs. I don't recall having anyone on there. You, Sam, any in your experience, has that happened?
the closest I've seen is occasionally a JD or an ethicist who is intended to bring some extra scope, but a pure representative from the advocacy groups, the disease groups, I've not seen. The one thing I'll comment to Valerie, having spent many hours of my life in discussions with regulators about endpoints, is there's a component of that endpoint thing that's just totally out of the hands of the trialists. There are times when FDA says the only acceptable endpoint is X or Y. And if you don't meet on that endpoint, we will not allow you to market the drug. And so for a company that's been working hard to raise the money to do it, if FDA says we're not going to allow this, their hands are sort of tied. So there's an element of advocacy that I think needs to happen through the regulators, but it's not always. And FDA has been working hard. They have been trying really hard to be more adaptive and more useful there, but it'll vary disease by disease and need some work at the very early phase. That's before the trial ever launches. And then the second thing is a frustrating feature of statistics. And that's that if you ask 20 questions of a data set, one of them's guaranteed to be statistically significant, even though there's no effect. And that's just the nature of random chance. And so to prevent that, the statisticians call that type 1 error. That's seeing something that isn't really there. And the way we use statistics, one time out of 20, you're going to see something that's just not there. So the way they do that is you use your statistical, they call it power, to look at the main thing. If you see a signal on another endpoint, there's a lot of worry that that's not a true signal, that it doesn't actually help that endpoint. And so the way it's slow and frustrating, the way you manage that is if you see one of those secondary endpoints look promising, that given trial isn't considered reliable evidence of that. But what you can do is take that trial, go to the FDA, go to the suppliers of funds that you need, and do a new trial where you invest all that statistical power on that endpoint. And then you can get a win on it. But trust me, I've been with so many trialists who have the exact same emotional response you do. They miss the primary. They feel like they got it on a secondary, and they're so mad that it's not allowed to be declared a success. And then here's the sad part. You go back and do the new trial, and it wasn't a real signal after all. So that's just a feature of the biological world and the nature of random chance. But it's so hard. Highly professional trialists have the same fears, concerns, worries, and frustrations around that you've expressed. And the reality is often when you do the new trial, it wasn't a real signal.
Yeah, it can get quite messy for sure, and complicated. One comment from a listener is that their company does have representatives from patient advocacy groups on some of their studies, DSMB. So it's good to know that does happen. And maybe we should have that be more encouraged throughout the industry.
Yeah. No, you're right. Classically, when we're putting together a DSMB, we want an experienced trialist, we want a biostatistician and an ethicist, and then a couple other people broadly overlapping. But maybe that we need to do a better job of thinking that through. There are some technical requirements, strict confidentiality. You can't tell another soul. You can't share it with other people. So you have to be really very careful. And it does take some training to be able to do that. And then there are certain statistical requirements that DSMBs need to follow, but people can be trained up around that and still have representation. I think it's a good idea to think about that, particularly in areas where there's a strong patient community that's coalescing around that trial.
Yeah, I think there'd be a lot of volunteers. I think one person did, I think the same person probably said, to your point, the biggest challenge is the confidentiality piece. Can't go posting on Facebook things that happen in the meeting.
Yeah, and you can't even tell your life partner.
Yes,
it's like full on secret stuff.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Why all the secrecy? And what are the downsides of, because people always say, let's have full transparency.
Yeah.
So what's at risk with full transparency, as it were?
Yeah, there's two main issues, and one of them is frustrating and weird, but we're probably stuck with it. And that's when a trial is being run by a company that gets its funding from the capital markets, i.e., it's like publicly traded company. There are strict rules about that. And if you don't maintain the confidentiality, there's huge risks for insider trading, stock speculation. Like when I was running this big trial, I would get like an email a week from some day trader trying to just sneak some information out of me so that he could make a more intelligent stock trade. So confidentiality when you're dealing with a publicly traded company, you're just stuck. You got to obey the SEC rules, and that's material information that has to be restricted until it's done. Once it's done, you release it, of course. The second thing that's both to me more interesting and harder. What people found was that investigators, trialists in the pre-DSMB model, they'd look at the data as much as they could. I mean, we're obsessive about our trials, and honestly, all of us, probably even me included, if there weren't for DSMBs, I would want to look at the data like every week, like, show me what we got, show me what we got. And the problem, again, goes back to that statistics question. If you ask the same question 20 times, there's a risk you're going to get a false answer that's positive, and then you shut down the trial because we got our positive answer. And I've felt myself earlier in my career, it wasn't in a trial circumstance, but it was, we were watching something over time, a cohort, and there's this question, how often do you get a look before you decide? And there was a look, and boy, it looked good. It was so close. Can we just push it a little longer? And had to take a deep breath and say, we want to know the truth. We don't want to know what we hope. We want to know what's true. And that statistics gives you the better ability to find what's true. So there's an element of finding things that aren't there if you look at the data too much. And so the DSMB has strict rules, even for the DSMB, about how often they can do a formal statistical test of it. And the trialists are not allowed to see any of it. The other thing that you see is that there's a lot in trials that depends on the trialists having what's called equipoise, where they think it's, where they don't believe they know the answer in it already. And it turns out if you believe you already know the answer unconsciously, you make lots of changes in how you run a trial, how you follow up endpoints, how you understand what comes next. That, protocols are super detailed, but there's still plenty that's at clinician or investigator discretion. And if you got that unconscious bias from having seen the data a few times in advance, you may unconsciously change the type of patient you refer into the trial, which will suddenly make it not at all clear who the results apply to in the future. You may change the way you implement for people who are assigned the treatment versus not, that then again ends up being a measure of the influence of your extra care rather than the molecule or the treatment itself. And you can, again, this is all unconscious. There are so few nefarious actors, but we're all human. And the other possibility is that you'll, without even realizing it, you'll just ever so subtly change the measurement of that endpoint. Like you'll have a more positive affect when you go in to talk to the patient about quality of life and say, well, it seems like you're doing pretty well. Let's go and do this quality of life assessment now. So the problem is, if you let the data out along the way, there's pretty good evidence from how we used to run trials and from just the basic principles of statistics that it would substantially cloud our ability to know what's true rather than to know what we want to be true. So that's why that confidentiality exists, even where you're not working with a company that has SEC reporting requirements.
So Valerie, from your perspective of as a participant or a patient or patient advocate, we are calling it confidentiality. Is that interpreted as a veil of secrecy, and does that engender some sort of distrust of the medical research or the medical community? Or what's the other side of that risk?
Well, especially for me, since my background is in research. So coming into my son's diagnosis, I was more familiar with what a research study would take, not from obviously a medical background, but from a psychological background and research I had done. So I already had a leg up on a lot of my cohort families in terms of understanding what research studies involved and why confidentiality and things like that were important. But because of that, I had to explain to other families, because they didn't, when they would sit down and talk with their investigator, there's support lacking in terms of being able to talk to families who are most likely going through one of the most difficult periods of their lives. And possibly maybe a professional therapist or counselor, someone should be brought in with the investigator to help explain some of these aspects to them in ways that they can actually absorb. Many times when you're first starting your trial, there are words being said, but you're so processed in the grief of what you're facing, it's hard to actually focus and retain that information. So there are families that are like, well, what's actually happening? And they have some trust issues. And that's where they go to their patient advocacy groups or their foundations who can work as an intermediary for them or help explain some of these things to them. But it would be nice if the trials themselves included some type of resource like that for families up front who could sit down with them, talk them through it a little bit more on a personal level as opposed to on a trial level, if that makes a bit of sense. Because sometimes within families, when we're working with our investigators, when we're working with our clinicians, that is for our loved one. We have to try to compartmentalize that in a way, and maybe we can't be the full human experience that we need to be, that we could with possibly a counselor or someone else that was there specifically for that role. Does that make sense in a way?
Yeah, I think so. And there's a question here that's sort of related to that, in the sense that they're asking about balancing like what the participants are being told versus the SEC regulated public release. But the implication in that question is that there might be a difference, that people might know within the trial participation information before it's public, but I don't think that's true, right? I mean, what's being communicated to the trialist and or the participants has to be public information, because there's no way that you can keep it secret. And someone also commented the other risk of transparency is it jeopardizes patents. So there are a lot of risks of that. So no one is going to sort of say, okay, we're going to tell you this, but don't tell anybody else. That never works, right? So any information that's being communicated through a moderator, a mediator, as you're talking about, or the trialists themselves, it's got to be public information.
Yes.
Just
there's times that the patients, as Sam was alluding to, we wish we knew what was going on, but we don't. We don't know everything until it's published. We only have our own individual insights into how we see it in our loved one. And we take that with caveat because of bias and other things. But in terms of the confidentiality, I think most families understand that. They may get frustrated by it, but if they had someone that they could speak to about it with more when they do have those concerns. Because a lot of times, like your investigator, they come in, they see you, you may see them that time that you visit, you may not. It depends on which trial you're in and how often you have to meet with them. Or you may see someone on their team. You may not be able to establish the type of relationship that would allow you to feel trust or comfortable asking certain questions. So building in a support person, building in a support team for the families. So, and I'll say that during our trial experience, the people that we interacted with on a visit basis, we had very good relationships with, we felt very cared for and trusted. And then when my son's trial was ended, everything was gone. Our complete support system was over. There was no aftercare, no after discussions provided. And I know that some of that has to be regulatory, but from going to when I had to report every time my son had a Band-Aid, because it could be attributed to an adverse reaction, to zero contact was very difficult. And that's very difficult on families when we've had to report every single little thing. And now we have questions and we're told, well, we really can't talk to you about anything. And it's just a complete, or again, my experience in 2017, it was almost a complete cutoff. Hopefully things have improved since then. And I'd like to hear if anything like that has been put in place for families now.
I've seen some companies have people like that hired or contracted or regionally. I don't know if it's common across the industry, but I will say that, you know, when it comes to your son wasn't in a gene therapy trial, I presume. So when it comes to gene therapy, there's, you know, an obligation to follow patients at least 5 years with AAV vectors and with other more persistent types of viruses like herpes virus or integrating retrovirus. You know, it's 15 years. So there is some sort of obligation on the sponsor to stay in touch. Obviously, they're not going to have the same resources to put into it as they do when the trial's ongoing. But for those that are not gene therapy, it sounds like that's an even bigger issue because they can just sort of cut off the drug and be done with it. So that is a bit scary. Sam, do you have comments about that?
Yeah, this is really helpful for me. Again, I do adult ICU research as like when I'm running trials, that's the domain that I'm working in. So this is helpful to hear from that other community. Our assumption as trialists and as DSMBs is that the local investigation team is embedded in a clinical team, and that clinical team would provide the continuity and wrap up. That there's some and this may be just my complete ignorance, but my guess is there's some doctor that's the key go-to doctor for a child with Sanfilippo syndrome. And presumably that's the doctor that refers you into the trial and maybe even is the investigator on the trial. And I think maybe naively on the trialist DSMB side, we've just assumed that same doc would be the one that would provide follow-up and debrief and contact. But it sounds like that may not.
No, especially not in rare disease. Like in our case, my son, we live in Houston. Our trial site was in Minnesota. So we don't have any built-in support locally, and we now no longer are getting trial funding to help us travel. So then, and it was not, there was no information passed off to local doctors because all the data is not available. So that's a real disconnect that I see sometimes when that happens.
Unfortunately, it's not uncommon, and particularly if companies go belly up or a drug, you know, is discontinued. We see that in oncology all the time, especially in pediatrics. Something failed in the adult world, and we have to stop our pediatric trial. I guess just getting it back to gene therapy. There's a different considerations when it comes to gene therapy because usually it's a one-time treatment. So those who have been enrolled don't have to give up their treatment. They have ongoing therapy. It's really more than about other patients getting access to it. But so there's a lot of nuanced issues here. You know, I guess, and emotionally, you've sort of talked to that about the emotional impact of trials going on hold or ending, and I guess you bring it really home well with this sort of longer term effect that you not only are you cut off from what you're used to, but there's really nowhere to go, especially when it's far away. And I guess one question is, in the era of social media and very connected families, how does one ensure equity in communication across global trials? That's probably a difficult one for us. Any thoughts about that?
One thing, a couple of important trials that I worked on were with Tony Fauci's shop at NIH, the NIAID. And I was really impressed. And I think they got this out of their experience in AIDS, but they have a group within NIAID whose focus is community outreach, communication. And I was really impressed. They put together a lot of, I think we call them flipboards, even though they're not flipboards anymore, but simple, accessible, clear communications in cartoons with writing, some videos and then some approaches to communication that were very focused on making sure we were reaching people that historically have not had full access to trials. I was really impressed by that infrastructure and found myself wanting it for all my trials, and I think would recommend that sponsors stand up activities like that. There is that little asterisk that all that stuff has to go through IRBs, so it takes some time to get there. And then NIH did engage with, and I know some industry sponsors as well, there are some community groups that have figured out how to communicate out to their groups and are available as consultants. And I can imagine that, for example, Valerie's nonprofit might be one that could position itself to accept contracts to work on that kind of messaging. It's been my experience that a combination of an infrastructure within the sponsor and an advocacy group that is connected either to the disease or to the racial ethnic community of interest, that it's that kind of nexus of people who are actually embedded in the communities and an infrastructure to accept them that gives us our best chance at doing this well.
That I think is helpful, because I think one of the things we had hoped to come out of this hour was some take-home points about what could be done or changed, or what sponsors should be looking at doing. And some of our listeners, based on their questions and answers, are quite distraught, Valerie, at your experience of being cut off, and suggesting that certainly with gene therapy, there ought to be a higher bar for far longer monitoring. You know, as I mentioned, there is FDA regs that require sponsors to at least touch base with participants for a certain number of years, even after the study is over. But what do you have any ideas, Valerie, about what could be done differently, like so that you're not dropped off a cliff like that?
And that's a really accurate way to describe it. That is exactly how it felt. And again, I say this as a person who has education and who had financial means, and I felt neglected. So I can only imagine in terms of the broader community when this happens, if other people have similar experiences. My one thing that, and I worked with the Cure Sanfilippo Foundation and other advocacy groups, is building in those early preclinical trial stages, building in aftercare. That needs to be a set up thing that is thought at the very beginning, and how that's going to look. And taking that in either as the trial is completed and we still provide some type of aftercare, the trial's put on hold and we still have check-in points, or the trial has ended and we still provide some level of aftercare to all families. That needs to be thought about from the very beginning, so that it is included, so that it is funded, so that it is planned well. And then working with the families during the trial, again, this idea of the support and community network, connecting them to patient advocacy groups if they're not already connected, making sure that they have that background, or having staff members or part of the clinical trial team be designated as support services for the families going forward as touch points. Because it was, and we would call, we would be told we really can't talk to you about anything. We were concerned because our son was experiencing some effects that we were concerned was coming off of his treatment, and there was no care provided for that at all. Thankfully, we do live in an area that has good medical resources, and we were able to access those to make sure that he recovered well. But that's not the case for everyone. And it was a very discouraging experience. And I know, because within our community, in the Sanfilippo community, we've had several trials end early. And it makes our patient population more hesitant to engage in any trials. And that doesn't help the science going forward. If families, especially in small rare disease communities where we need participants to make any type of statistical significance, if they don't feel that they'll be taken care of, we've had families go, I'd rather just live with my child and love them, as opposed to go through what you're talking about, which was hope, and then hope taken away and no one seemed to care afterwards. So that's an important thing to remember, because it does impact your patient population.
Yeah, and like you said, impacts their sort of willingness to participate again, or others to participate at all. So I guess one of the things that was commented by another committee member, the Q&A, was that they're hearing that, good communication and proactive upfront anticipation of potential holds, of potential challenges. But they also make the comment that, is that too much to ask of the informed consent process? We don't really have a crystal ball. And we're leaving that up to the investigator who at each site to be able to carry out. Is there ways we can support them better? I'm not sure, provide them with more proactive information about potential issues. Any ideas about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is teaching me a lot. I appreciate it. It seems to me you've got at least a couple of options. One is just to add to the schedule of assessments or schedule of events, which is in any trial, it's the number of times that the trial team contacts you. We normally have a study closeout visit, but maybe you add one more visit at the end that is an aftercare visit, and the aftercare visit doesn't collect structured data, maybe, but it does collect unstructured data, meaning the investigative team talked to the patient family, and then they could send the comments back to the sponsor, because I think that would be helpful information to the sponsor, but not turn it into a formal visit where you got to do 6 questionnaires, et cetera. Just have it be a feedback session. And then I do think that it would make sense, but again, I don't run these organizations, so I'm not saying it has to be that way. Just as I'm hearing this, it seems to me that, particularly in rare diseases, my sense is that there's one dominant advocacy group for the disease. And it seems to me that those orgs could be in a good position to develop an infrastructure on their side that would be paid for by sponsors under contract to provide aftercare for trial participants. And that, by setting up those contracts, that could allow the foundation, or I assume they're generally called foundations, that could allow the foundation to get a 0.1 or a 0.2 FTE of a medical director. And that medical director's job, aside from having the MD go MD, is to be a part of that aftercare function. That my sense is sponsors want to do the right thing. It's just sometimes a little hard to know what the right thing is, and it can be hard to thread the needle on the regulatory regime. But if we give a clear answer that credible trials in this community are going to include an aftercare component, and you add one visit to the schedule of events, and then you contract out an aftercare function, I think that could get through the regs. You'd have a harder time if the foundation were trying to do during trial interaction stuff, because they'd have to get lots of extra training and scrutiny to be members of the investigative team. But if the role they're playing is an aftercare continuity connection role, I think that has a little bit more of room from the regulatory perspective to be of use. I wonder whether that, I mean, everybody's always a little anxious when money changes hands, et cetera, but the reality is, to get important work done and to find new treatments and do it well requires money. Yeah, you can't just.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea that's come out of this discussion, and something that's applicable for all clinical trials, not just those that have a problem or go on hold or get stopped. And so, since we're at time, I think we'll end with that idea, and also with the following comment that someone made. It seems like Valerie's experience is a throwback to the time when we considered research subjects rather than the new way of thinking of research participants.
Right.
And they comment there's a lot of work to incorporate the principle of respect for persons. So and there's many comments thanking both of you for all of your insights and comments. So I appreciate your spending time with us today. And sorry that we're out of time, but I want to thank you guys for the great discussion, and all the attendees for the thoughtful questions. Be sure to tune in to tomorrow's panel, which is about risk. We always talk about benefit, risk versus risk. So tomorrow's title is what are we talking about when we talk about risk? So on behalf of PGTME, I'd like to thank all who attended, participated, or helped put this webinar together, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you all.
Thanks, all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Valerie.